Very pleased today to be introducing those to you who do not know Ken Wilber, the integral philosopher, once known as a transpersonal philosopher and psychologist theorist, American contemporary, and a very important thinker in my view. I often refer to his work in my own work, and to this point, after doing some 40 plus videos, I realized I've never actually addressed talking about Ken Wilber and integral theory and philosophy. So I will get to that in this video to give some highlights of what I really love about Ken Wilber's work, some of the things I'm critical about in his work as an overview, not with any in-depth in any particular area, but let me start with the words of Ken Wilber in a question and answer in one of his books, a very important book. I'll come back to that in a moment. Question. So these stages, there are several stages in this transpersonal growth? Answer, Ken Wilber. Yes, that's right. But again, in a very fluid and flowing way. In looking at these higher stages or waves of consciousness, we have a rather small pool of daring men and women, both yesterday and today, who have bucked the system, fought the average and normal, and struck out toward the new and higher levels of awareness. In this quest, they joined with a small group or sangha of like-spirited souls and developed practices or injunctions or paradigms that would disclose these higher world spaces. Injunctions or paradigms are interior experiments that would allow others to produce their results and therefore check and validate or reject their findings. And they left us their maps of this interior journey with the curious proviso that simply memorizing the map will not do. Reading about sacred texts will not do. We have to practice the practices. And that was Ken Wilber's introduction to really his view on the reality that empirical knowledge, even, quote, scientific knowledge, does not belong only in the material, visible world. It belongs, empiricism, as a methodology and as a way of validating knowledge in the spiritual, or what we might call just the invisible realms, the more subtle, the noumenal, not just the phenomenal world. Well, that's a quick little intro of the voice of Ken Wilber, someone who has over, I think, 30 books now, published many, self-authored, many with other people. He started entire movements. He attempted to start an integral university in around 2000. His work goes way back to the 70s. Again, I can barely give a synopsis, and I won't try to give a serious synopsis of his work here overall. Back in the 74, he was a very young man and started publishing in the transpersonal psychology field. Transpersonal psychology field being one of the waves of the psychology movements, especially coming out of the United States, from everything from psychoanalysis, first wave, behavioral cognitive, second wave, humanistic existential psychology, and the third wave, and transpersonal psychology was the fourth wave at that time. He left that movement, again, publishing critiques all the time as he did. He was investigating psychology and philosophy and spirituality all in this very interesting interplay. And he got critical after a while of the transpersonal psychology movement, drug culture at that time. Not that he's some kind of anti-drug person, he's certainly not, and he's done his own share of those explorations. But he started reading East-West philosophy, dropped out of his master's degree in science, and said, this is more interesting. So away he went as a young early 20-something fellow, and eventually wrote a wonderful book called Spectrum of Consciousness. And I highlight that book at the age of 23. To me, he was very similar to many of the great philosophers, including the likes of people like Arthur Schopenhauer, for example, again, writing, they're probably one of their most important works at the age in the early 20s. Anyways, Wilbur then started forming, he thinks somewhere around early 80s, he dropped out of the transpersonal movement after kind of critiquing its overly interior and overly even spiritual attempt to try to capture reality and truth at these higher levels of consciousness, as I was just reading about those levels. But what he did so importantly was to say we need a much more balanced, and he came up with a 4-quadrant, all levels theory of knowledge and epistemology, which I use as whenever I refer to in my writing as holistic integral. I'm really referring to the good stuff that came from the holistic movement that was kind of a parallel exploration coming out of even the early 20th century, and then into the movements of human potential movement and systems theory, etc., and that came into the 20th century and still influences us today if you're a thinker who's interested in big pictures, big systems. So Ken Wilber was part of that movement, and he developed his own unique synthesis of the great thinkers throughout time, as I say, an East-West synthesis, plus all the developmental in the West, the developmental psychology theorists, Piaget, Erik Erikson, Maslow, and Kohlberg, and so on, Robert Keegan. So he was this great synthesizer, and that's where, when I found his work, which I'll get to the history in a moment of my finding and some of my critiques as well, that's what I love. So these are the things that I'm loving. I'm just sharing first, right off the top, a great thinker for our time. I feel very fortunate that I was able to live in this lifetime when he's alive as a contemporary and learn from him and just really get a larger picture, the big picture as he often calls it, of knowledge, of methodologies of knowing, and this holistic view. And really it's a view that embraces the most diversity, he argues, this integral theory, a theory of everything, he'll sometimes call it, that embraces the most diverse kinds of knowledges from the most diverse perspectives. We've heard of first person, second person, third person perspectives. He stretches it to actually 8 perspectives of voicing and of understanding and of knowing, and ultimately of what he says the cosmos gets to know itself through these at least 8 perspectives, or maybe more. He says there may be more levels of consciousness than the 8 or 9 he often talks about. But again, he's sort of drawing on universal theories, and again, East and West, across time, cultures, and history. And that trying to find a really unifying way to bring diversity into unity, and making sure that unity doesn't become rigid and overly totalizing, to keep all the particularity and the diversity still very alive and informing the sense of unity. So you can see ultimately he's got a sense of a kind of neo-Hegelian kind of philosophy, although a huge difference from his work from Hegel's in the 19th century in Germany, that it really was a movement of spirit, he said. And really you could put the word consciousness. Again, there's where you hear Hegel coming into the understanding of how evolution of ideas and of consciousness itself moves through the universe. So that if you're looking for a kind of theory to make sense of a whole lot of things, that's what I love about his work. When I started reading it in 1981, his first book, didn't know him. He was not famous at that time at all. Yeah, he became famous probably in the early 90s, sort of more on an international scale. But yeah, way back in those days, I was just not very informed on, all the different philosophies, never mind the East West. I was reading, a little bit, mostly Eastern philosophy at that time in my 20s. But it was so nice to have a big thinker like this, a synthesizer, who could kind of, take you through understanding each of those different kinds of theorists and thinkers and philosophers and spiritual gurus, etc. And then he would kind of put them into a position or a story, kind of a narrative of how their teaching represented a particular kind of consciousness, and it was influenced by historical influences of other thinkers' predecessors. And then you got this whole sort of web of connectedness of, oh, now I know how that philosophy of, Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or whoever, Rousseau, would make sense within this bigger pattern of what he ends up sort of calling a spectrum of consciousness. And then, even more exciting was, as I kept reading his work after 1981, other works on psychology more than on philosophy, and even did some work, in anthropology he was synthesizing. But yeah, with the psychology was really useful to me. I was just starting to become interested in psychology because I do come out of a science, kind of hard materialist, empiricist background as environmental ecology and so on. That when I got into psychology, it was, again, I wanted to place all the different people, like how does William James fit in? How does Carl Jung fit in? Or Freud and so on, as well as, many of the feminist thinkers in psychology as well. And Wilson Schaef, who I really enjoyed her work over the years and so on. So I was really curious how he was going to fit all those together, and he really did make some kind of picture. I'm not saying it's all totally accurate, but that's part of that mapping he talks about in that quote. And it's through that mapping that I just love getting that sense of the connection. So the patterns, right? The patterns within patterns of how different thinking and ideas, and that's really the key here, is that in a way the cosmos is evolving. And I use cosmos on the largest sense, as he does, with both all its exteriorities of the cosmos, its physicalities, and then its interiorities of ideas of thinking and consciousness itself, and consciousness becoming conscious of itself in this meta-reflective universe that we seem to be in. Humans representing the most significant, perhaps, of the meta-reflection on reflection of getting this big map. That's something humans have been able to do, which no other creature that we know of has been able to do, putting the universe into a big picture. So that's how the cosmos gets to know itself, is through all these diversities of ideas and knowledges, wisdom and compassion that flows and evolves, it grows. And then, of course, at times it grows in kind of twistedness and in regressive currents, he would show, and he would say, well, yeah, well, that's kind of like we had some progress there, we were really doing well in certain ideas and evolution and a kind of liberation process, right? Because the spirit's moving through evolution, he would argue, or consciousness is moving through evolution towards more and more liberation from what the Buddha said, life is suffering. Arthur Schopenhauer said pretty much the same thing in a more Western way that he did in the 19th century in Germany, idealist philosophy. I'm intrigued by that. I'm intrigued by the liberation, emancipatory journey, not of just peoples and cultures and ethnocentric and egocentric perspectives, but from a world perspective. So kind of, how is the world soul, as one could call it? Schopenhauer used this term, Emerson used this term, and others. How is that attachment and connection to consciousness itself at that level of world soul, where we start to have that huge perspective? Where is the whole kind of soul of the planet, in a way? Where is that going? And of course, we are an individual reflection of that whole soul. So it's not one or the other. It's always in a co-relational, reflective embrace and wisdom that can be gained from that large perspective right down to the micro perspective of my little life and my little decisions in my small life. So big life, small life, he integrates so well and then does it in this, as I say, a grand picture. So on the love side, that's a lot of it. And I particularly want to just add to that, that I loved learning about how he locates conflict as its importance in understanding reality, truth, the development and evolution and history of humanity and of consciousness itself, which goes beyond humanity, of all organisms. So he had a really good conflict perspective of understanding that. I can't go into all the details of it, but he really shows very nicely how development itself, as you move from one level to a more complex level, more complex system, um, the higher system, the lower systems in a way are in conflict with that development. At one level, they provide the foundation for that growth, and at another level, they pull back down to try to keep. And there's various complex reasons he goes into of why development is pulled back down to that norm, right? The status quo, that which is familiar, that which was adaptive. And so systems, you can apply this to human cultural systems, as you can see, as well as biological systems, have a tendency for that kind of conservativizing, pulling back down to the way it used to be. This worked for us in the past. But under changing conditions, as Wilber says, and that's part of evolutionary theory and good observation, is that changes in the environment cause and require changes in the species ecology, its behaviors, and even right down to the genetics level and epiphenomenal level, there has to be changes and adaptations. So he said there's a conflict between the lower and the higher always, and even as the higher evolves, it starts to even put down and want to diss and forget the foundations. So he said that, you could kind of look at evolution as moving along this uprising current of greater and greater development, but that which goes up must come down and back to reintegrate with the lower levels, so that you don't get too arrogant and thinking that you can just take off and go up even forever, and that kind of transcendentalism. But then he says you can also get caught in those who think that the best way is the way down, which he called the eco camp arising, eco camp descending. The descending current can start to become part of a force of oppression itself to prevent further ascending. So he marks out this huge cosmological, you can see, metaphysical view of ascending and descending currents, which he also traces back. It's not original completely for him at all, going back to Plotinus and some of Plato, but particularly Plotinus, he really admires the metaphysical conception of this eros, driving love, agape, giving love, growth, development that stays integrated. What goes up must come down and reintegrate, then go on to its next level of this great grand spiral of evolution. So you can see my love for those big picture views, the spiral of growth and development. Why? Because as a curriculum theorist and thinker and philosopher myself, I am interested, when I design some curriculum or piece of writing that I will use as a teaching or my own being, living in the world, always wanting to be on a expanding path and watching out for those pathological regressions, fear-based patternings, as I call them. And Wilber, I'll get to that later, has a very good theory on metaphysics of fear, with that love that I just talked about as driving and the great forces of metamotivation. So I was really interested in, understanding those designs, the designs of the cosmos itself, the designs of spirit as it moves in and through evolution, and thus also through the history of humankind and how we craft it. Well, most people who study history or evolution don't always have at all that kind of huge big picture he does of interiorities and exteriorities. Most evolutionists and historians, as well as developmental psychologists and so on, tend to often focus on the physical, the obvious, the factual, and they miss this interior empirical truths and reality going on within systems of consciousness development. So that would be key for understanding Wilber, is he's a theorist of consciousness development and evolution. And he's not afraid to include, science, religion, arts and morals, philosophy, all as important, equally important, and arts, all equally important in the understanding and making unknowing, and understanding that's so important to us being part of in a harmonious way. You see, not that it's all harmony. It's obviously, it's very conflict ridden, he actually says. And that's because that's part of its development. It's part of its evolution of the cosmos, is in a sense not all agreeing with everybody and everything. In fact, if you look at the world, it's pretty competitive and it's pretty vicious in many ways. The fact of a universe that's pretty hard on life. And life is a real struggle to maintain itself within the flows of entropy and the dissipation of life into a reduction into decay and death, and going back to the elements, as they say. So he's very aware of a very conflictual cosmos. Well, I'm interested in that because I think humans are incredibly conflicted, not only interiorly, as young Freud would say, or even Arthur Schopenhauer would say, prior to Jung and Freud. And it's a harmony, this universe as well, because of this ascending and descending current moving, which he and others, Plotinus, would say is love-based. It's a kind of goodness that exists for life, and certainly life on Earth. And there's a beauty in that, and there's a beauty in even the conflict and the horror and terror of predator-prey relations, for example, which are essentially the foundation of an ecology of fear for all organisms. Is that you may be eaten tomorrow, today you will decay, diseases will take you over eventually one way or another, etc., etc., etc. You will go down and you will go out and be deleted in your current form. However, spirit, as Ken Wilber articulates, and these big theorists and philosophers like Plotinus would articulate spirit to continue as its course, unbothered in a way by all that form problem of appearing, disappearing. All right, well, just in the last bit, then I'll focus on conflict parts of Ken Wilber. Is very controversial, and what I've just shared in these theories of everything are very controversial, seen as universalizing grand narratives, and postmodernism has really attacked those kinds of what they would call modernist thinking. Ken Wilber would argue, and argues very beautifully. I love how he critiques postmodernism. He embraces postmodernism's arising after modernism, right? Pre-modern, modern, postmodern. And then he says he's thinking integrally. That's why it's called integral theory, integral consciousness work. He says it's really postmodern. So the postmodernists are kind of right in between modernism, and they think they're kind of the highest, the hairiest, the wildest, the most rebellious, and they're criticizing everything before them. And see, that's that kind of, as a new consciousness arises, it tends to want to diss what came before it as, passé, old, traditional, very twisted, very skewed, immature. So I love Ken Wilber's more integral postmodern view, which is to understand all of those levels, all of those accomplishments, right back to the very earliest complements of consciousness evolving, new ideas evolving about how to live, and adaptations toward, and immanence in actually embodying the cosmos and its laws of reality and life. Ken Wilber says that's all has to be respected, and that's what his work in integral theory respects, all those differences and diversities in a way that I do not see in any other theory, philosophy that I've come across. So I would argue he is the most advanced thinker on the planet today in synthesizing and making available that wisdom and the compassion that goes with that wisdom, which he's very clear of. You have to have both. The wisdom of that arising higher to the compassion of the embracing of all the diversity in the lower. Significance, foundational, keep them in balance, and complementarity is what his theory and philosophy argues. There's no big privileging here of what's the better view, although one could say, well, but isn't a postmodern view better than all the rest? And in a way it is, because it has the biggest picture on everything and it can embrace that difference. And at the same time, only a postmodern perspective integral is not going to handle and be adequate to all the environmental circumstances and different developmental levels of groups, institutions, countries, and individuals. So there's an appropriateness, right, to all of those different systems that are adapting and with their own intelligence, have great resources that won't be accessible through just a postmodern view. But the postmodern view is a better view in the sense than just having a smaller view at a smaller level, because we can better think about managing all that diversity, which we have to today. We're in such a global, incredibly complex and fast-moving world. Never humanity has gone through this before. Consciousness has never gone through this experiment it's in right now, arguably, of this amount of knowledge and information across great, broad and deep aspects of the entire reality, capital R. So we are now at time, we have to have this higher perspective to integrate that and then not get into all these unnecessary and or just pathological conflicts. So there's good, healthy conflicts, and then there's really pathological, dissing and violent conflicts of domination, whether that domination is the lower trying to dominate the new emergent higher, or the higher that's emerged trying to dominate and subvert and diss the lower foundations upon which it actually relies upon. So you see, there's a great compassion once you get this perspective. He calls it a dialectical progress. You know, we move ahead, but we also have regressions and problems of communication within systems, within levels, as he calls it, within quadrants and all levels. You can look that up. All quadrants, all levels is his foundational map of his methodology and epistemology and ontology. So from a philosophical point of view, I think it's very sound. And that's, you know, a whole other video, but it really addresses really important issues about subjectivity and objectivity on that scale, and individualism and collectivism, and then how we can understand and map the entire cosmos in this great spot within those four parameters, kind of like compass points for keeping a good truthing, a good sense of staying in touch with the reality of where the cosmos is going, and not getting all arrogant in our little favorite quadrant, or we want to hang out more subjectivist or more objectivist or more individualist or more communalist, collectivist in our thinking. It's just the perfect model. Sorry to say perfect is a horrible word, but I think it is perfect, scare marks, for our time, and has emerged only within, I mean, it's had a history, this integral thinking, this kind of postmodern, but it's never ever taken off, right? And even now, it's such a very minor percent of people who are functioning at that level, and or not just intellectually, but actually operate and live at that level is even rarer. So we're talking less than 1%, or I think even less than that, who are actually gravitationally integral thinkers, people, beings. So again, this is not an elitist model. It's actually showing that we just require that perspective. And we require it because our times are that of the conditions of that complexity to be able to manage, integrate all of the struggling and conflicting conditions. So one of the things that I've not seen in how most people understand Ken Wilber, it's very rare. I don't think I've ever really seen it other than my own writing, that he is a conflict perspective. And I asserted that thesis in this article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology back in 1997 when it was published. I started this research in 1993. And it was really looking at the critics of Ken Wilber and then how Ken Wilber responds to those critics. And through that, I came up with my sort of own analysis and really said he really is a conflict theorist of the sociological conflict tradition, of the critical philosophy tradition. And he's kind of a newest branch, right? Even from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Philosophy into Jürgen Habermas, who's kind of, you know, a newer, very contemporary reach beyond that traditional Marxist, neo-Marxist schools. And then Wilber even going beyond that as a branch beyond Habermas, integrating Habermas, who he says is one of the greatest, living philosophers of our time. And then he takes it, Wilber, into this, what I'd call this transpersonal spectrum consciousness theorizing, which Habermas doesn't do. And this is a very exciting path or set of branches if you want to follow that theoretically and philosophically. And then, of course, ultimately, we have to figure out how we live with that. So in terms of critiques, I just want to say that the critics have missed that Wilber's work is a marvelous fear management model. So it's a good conflict management education model. It's a good fear management education model. And that's one of the things I look for whoever I read. Somebody gives me a book or tells me I should read so-and-so, I look and I always go and flip through, scan. I sometimes just even look in the index and go, okay, so where's the word conflict? Where's the word fear? How are they bringing forth those two concepts and notions? And any of you who know my work, domination, conflict, fear, violence, the DCFV theory is really core to my work. I have that on other videos and writing, but without going into it, you have to understand how conflict and fear in the middle of domination and violence, conflict and fear are the real catalyzing and essential forces and processes that will influence all things in human systems, at least. Okay, so he does have a great conflict theory. I call him a conflict theorist, actually, and he has a great fear theory, and he's a good fear theorist. Now, both of those, conflict and fear theory, he does not bring out. And that's one of the things I'm very critical of him for not doing, and not bringing out those and bringing them forward as much as he could in his work. And he tends to get very interested in the anatomy and the super micro anatomy and morphology and dynamics of spiritual development. So he's got this really masculine type rising ascendancy pattern. And it's often very sort of individual psychology rather than a lot of good sociology. And so I'm talking about DCFV as a good integration of psychology and sociology, definitely in politics and so. He deals with sociology and politics. I mean, he does amazing writing, and many people who use his work adapt it and use integral theory in politics and law and criminology and sociology, and it's a tremendously influential theory today. If you do any research on it, you will see the last 30, 40 years it's taken off. I'm not saying it's common household knowledge or anything, but it's really been extremely successful and influential. So he's had a great career and he's not finished yet. So my interest is that in critique he's not brought those two forward, in fear and conflict, and that is inhibiting in my arguments, which I make in many of my writing, that it will inhibit the interpretations of Wilberian critical integral thought, and it will inhibit its effectiveness because he does not bring those forward, and or other people are not either, other than myself, that I know of. And so unfortunately, he gets caught in nasty critiques of others as they critique him, and these things fly back and forth, and I believe there's a lot of fear involved in all that critical and criticizing. Not all. There's some really good critiques going both ways, those who critique Wilber, those that Wilber comes back and critiques those critics and others. He's always been a critic of just about everybody. I also love him for that. So that's the downside, and the integral movement, what I would call that, which is prior to Ken Wilber, and there are other major integral type thinkers, theorists. You could look it up on the internet, integral theory, and you'll find access to many different others. But he is definitely one of the most, I would say, powerful and influential of the day, and has a very unique spin on this integral thinking, this integral consciousness that's evolved on the planet, that the cosmos has said and kicked up and is delivering as the next way to adapt to the major cascading crises and challenges of the future. So that's my biggest critique, just overall, and that Wilber, like everybody, is a personality brought up in a culture with certain kinds of masculinist, arrogant characteristics and personality structures, and all of those still influence him, unfortunately, and I think it gets him into a lot of messes. I critiqued him in that 1997 article, and he came back, he read my manuscript on that as a reviewer for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. This was in their mid-90s, and he wrote me quite a, he's very approving of my scholarship. He says, can't get better, great scholarship, but he says, I just can't stand you giving all these critics all this space again, etc. I've shared a lot of my fear work with him back in the earlier, a few years earlier, in the early 90s, and he said, well, good, keep going, it's interesting. He actually wrote back, he's very generous and will do that. But when he doesn't like something that you're doing, he lets you know. And quite likely, you probably, for many people, he pretty much cuts you out of his circle of connections, and that he did that to me back in the early 90s by saying my fear work in I was calling it phobosology at that time. Now I call it fearology, but I remember his quote was in the card he sent me, sounds like a nose disease, you might want to change the name. It was kind of a humorous dig, but fair enough. He just really thought I still, all this emphasis on fear, later all my emphasis on conflict in my graduate work, and I've shared all my manuscripts a lot in my both theses with him and so on, and he chooses not to respond. So I'm very critical of him not seeing and having insightfulness into this inner core of understanding all of human behavior and social systems and politics and so on, philosophical systems, is that without a deep understanding of fear and conflict, we will miss way more than, and we will not only miss, we will get ourselves in a big mess of fear and conflict with each other. And I've seen that in the integral movement, which should not, quote, have happened. But of course, it's all the cosmos, it's consciousness learning from itself, learning of its own errors. And the best we can do is be reflective of that. And that's the dialectic of progress conception that he purveys and he carries on even from the work of the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, this dialectic of progress, so that, we have to be compassionate with the faults, the miscommunications, the damages, the dramas, the hurts and the woundedness of life in, as I said, a very fragile life that always is under pressures, and under pressures makes errors and also has great accomplishments and innovations under those pressures. Okay, so that's my quick summarizing of Ken Wilber, my love and my critiques. Whether I do another video or not, I guess it'll depend on if I feel there's more important things to share about his work. I think that it will always be around for all kinds of people to learn from, and you can learn it really real simple simple interpretations by some authors who are now interpreting his work, and or read his direct works as well. And of course, there's tons of critics, and I think, a small percentage of them have really good critiques. The majority of them I find are very misplaced critiques, and I often hear a lot of ego and challenging competition in those critiques. And I too have been somewhat caught in that at different times, I have no doubt. Um, but I also keep my critiques as best I can within a good understanding of his work, and one that I think is valid in the sense that there's many others that agree, and even Ken Wilber agrees with many of my interpretations of his work over the years, especially in the early 90s. He said I really wasn't misinterpreting his work. In that major paper I did in 97 in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, I was just really giving too much attention to his critics, which he just couldn't stand, unfortunately. And a lot of his critics can't stand him and his work. So that continues, and that's no way to ultimately move to a really realization, and the sooner the better, of an emancipatory liberational path of fearlessness. Thanks very much for listening this day. I look forward to your comments, and if you have things to offer on Ken Wilber and others that you'd like me to talk about, drop me a note on the YouTube channel, and or email me distinctively, and I will be glad to look at perhaps creating another video. Bye now.